Jake Burns had always been a man of few words, but when it came to his property on the lake, his pride in it was unmistakable. The small, weathered dock at the edge of his land had stood there longer than most of the houses that now dotted the shoreline. His grandfather had built it by hand nearly 70 years ago, long before any talk of beautification committees or zoning improvement projects had started to circulate in the nearby town hall. The property itself was an old grant parcel, with riparian rights that were carefully documented in the county land records, a detail Jake had always taken comfort in. He had inherited the land and the house after his father passed away, and for years now, Jake had run a modest but steady business offering boat rentals and guided fishing tours on the lake. It wasn't a fortune, but it was honest work, and it gave him something many of his neighbors in the newer lakeside developments didn't have: true ownership and a deep connection to the place. Life had been simple enough until about a year ago, when Karen Miller took over as head of the local neighborhood committee, a self-appointed body that, while not officially part of the town's government, had grown disturbingly influential in recent years. Under her leadership, the committee had launched an aggressive campaign to modernize and upgrade the lakefront. Karen had once worked as a high-end real estate broker, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that her vision wasn't about preserving the charm or character of the lake. It was about turning it into a polished, marketable asset for developers and wealthy out-of-town buyers. She spoke often of attracting elite clientele and maximizing waterfront potential, buzzwords that had no meaning to folks like Jake, but which seemed to captivate the newer residents who had bought into the lake community in recent years. Jake kept to himself as much as he could, but it became impossible to ignore the increasing number of letters arriving in his mailbox from the committee. Thinly veiled demands to bring his dock up to code, invitations to meetings where it was clear his presence would only be used as a token opposition, and more than one stern notice warning of non-compliance. The irony, of course, was that Jake's dock didn't fall under any of the committee's jurisdiction. His riparian rights were grandfathered in under state law, and no amount of committee resolutions could change that. Jake knew this because he'd spent more than a few evenings down at the county courthouse reading through the land records himself, making sure there were no loopholes someone like Karen could exploit. His lawyer had confirmed it as well, but knowing the law was on his side didn't make the harassment any less aggravating. It all came to a head in the spring, about 2 months before the committee's much-hyped Lakeside Gala, an event Karen had promoted as the crown jewel of her redevelopment efforts. Posters had gone up all around town, sleek, glossy prints depicting a pristine lake with spotless piers, luxury boats, and upscale vendors. Nowhere in these staged visions was there room for Jake's weather-beaten dock or his rowboats and bait shack. He'd ignored it all until one morning, after a particularly heavy storm, when he went down to check on his boats and found the dock destroyed. It wasn't the storm that had done it. Jake knew the lake and its moods too well. The pilings had been sawed through cleanly, and parts of the structure had been dragged out and left tangled in the reeds. Someone had done this deliberately. There were no cameras on Jake's land, and the neighbors closest to him were snowbirds who hadn't returned yet for the season, so there were no witnesses. When Jake reported the vandalism to the local sheriff's office, the deputy had been polite but non-committal. "Looks like a property dispute, sir. You'd probably be better off handling this through your attorney." It was a familiar refrain, one Jake had heard too often lately. A few days later, Jake happened to run into Karen at the local diner. She approached him with that fixed, insincere smile of hers, as if nothing had happened. "Jake," she said brightly, "such a shame about your old dock, but sometimes these things are for the best. We're moving toward a more cohesive lakefront aesthetic." Progress can be difficult, but in the long run, it benefits everyone. Jake didn't reply. He simply stared at her for a long moment until she shifted uncomfortably and excused herself. But that encounter changed something in him. For the first time, Jake realized this wasn't going to stop unless he pushed back. harder than he ever had before. His lawyer, an old friend of the family named Richard Calhoun, confirmed what Jake already suspected. The committee had recently filed an application with the county to rezone parts of the lakefront, including Jake's section, in a way that would eventually strip away individual property rights under the guise of environmental protections and public access improvements. "They're trying to force you out," Richard had said bluntly. "Not legally, not directly, but through a war of attrition. If they can't make you comply, they'll make your life so difficult you'll want to sell." Jake wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. As Richard laid out the legal options, another piece of information came up, something Jake hadn't considered before. The old dam at the north end of the lake, which controlled the water level, was privately owned, not managed by the county or the town. The ownership had passed through several hands over the years, and the current holding company was rumored to be in financial trouble. If that dam changed hands, whoever owned it would have significant leverage over the lake's usage and maintenance. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized this might be the angle he needed. He wasn't a man to throw around money carelessly, but this was his land, his family's legacy. If Karen and her cronies were going to play games, then he would play them smarter. Quietly, through a separate legal firm not connected to the town, Jake began inquiries about acquiring controlling interest in the dam company. It was a long shot, but it wasn't impossible. Meanwhile, the committee's harassment continued. They filed nuisance complaints about Jake's business, alleging safety violations and environmental non-compliance. Inspectors showed up unannounced, and while they never found cause to issue fines, the interruptions were disruptive. Some of Jake's regular customers stopped coming, wary of the tension surrounding the lake. Local suppliers began getting cold feet about working with him, fearing they might be targeted next. Through it all, Jake kept working on the dam deal. He didn't tell anyone, not even Richard, until he was sure the pieces were falling into place. The negotiations were delicate. The company's owners weren't eager to publicize the sale, especially with Karen's group eyeing every move on the lake. It took months of careful maneuvering, but finally Jake secured the agreement he needed. He would be the new majority owner of the dam and, by extension, the one person with legal authority over the lake's water levels. By the time summer rolled around and the Gala preparations reached a fever pitch, Jake was ready. He filed the necessary paperwork for routine maintenance on the dam. Perfectly legal, well documented, and timed to begin just before the Gala. Karen, of course, was livid when the notice went public, but there was nothing she could do to stop it without revealing how much of the committee's plans rested on assumptions they had no legal right to make. As Jake stood on the shoreline that evening, watching the waterline slowly recede in preparation for the dam work, he allowed himself a rare smile. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in months he felt like he had the upper hand. The lake had always belonged to those who respected it, and Jake intended to remind everyone of that, no matter how polished their brochures or how expensive their yachts. The morning after Jake had posted the dam maintenance notice, the atmosphere around the lake shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. For weeks, the committee had been parading around with increasing arrogance, hosting planning meetings, booking vendors, and setting up temporary structures along the shore. Karen had taken every opportunity to remind the community that the upcoming Gala would put their lake on the map. And for many of the newer property owners, dazzled by her sales pitch of rising property values and elevated status, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. Jake had watched it all unfold with a mixture of irritation and grim amusement. He knew full well that Karen's grand vision stood on shaky legal ground, a facade of authority built on nothing but untested assumptions and the hope that no one would challenge them. But with the dam paperwork now in motion, the real battle had only just begun. Jake's notice of intent to perform routine maintenance on the dam was, on its face, unremarkable. Every few years, the dam required inspection and minor adjustments to ensure its continued safe operation. Standard procedure. The fact that Jake had timed it to coincide with the Gala weekend was, of course, entirely deliberate, but there was nothing in the regulations to prevent it. When Karen caught wind of it, her reaction was immediate and predictable. Within 48 hours, Jake received a formal letter from the committee's legal representative, alleging that his planned work on the dam was disruptive, unnecessary, and in violation of the spirit of community cooperation. It was, legally speaking, a laughable document, long on bluster, short on substance. Jake passed it along to Richard, who reviewed it and advised him to ignore it entirely. "They've got no case," Richard said flatly. "They're trying to bluff you into backing down." Jake wasn't about to be bluffed. What did surprise him, however, was how quickly the committee escalated their tactics. Within days of the letter, inspectors from various municipal departments began appearing at his property with increasing frequency. First, it was the Environmental Health Office, supposedly responding to an anonymous tip about fuel leaks from his boat storage. Then, the fire marshal arrived, citing an unverified report of improperly stored propane tanks. Each time, Jake cooperated fully, confident that everything on his property was up to code, and each time the inspectors left without issuing any violations. But the message was clear. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to create a climate of constant pressure. It wasn't long before the financial side of Jake's business began to feel the squeeze as well. Long-standing suppliers who had always provided equipment and bait began hesitating to fulfill orders, citing concerns about potential conflicts with the committee's redevelopment plans. One local printing company even canceled Jake's order for new marketing flyers, worried about losing other clients tied to the Gala. It was a coordinated effort, subtle enough to avoid direct legal repercussions, but relentless in its intent to undermine Jake's standing in the community. In the midst of this campaign, Karen herself made another move that took Jake by surprise. One morning, he received a certified letter informing him that the committee had voted to request a formal rezoning of the lakefront, including his property. The letter was filled with vague language about harmonizing public access and ensuring environmental stewardship. But the underlying goal was obvious: to strip away the legal protections that had preserved Jake's riparian rights for generations. It was an audacious play, one that would have to go through multiple layers of county approval to succeed, but it signaled that Karen was willing to push the fight to the next level. Faced with this new threat, Jake met with Richard again to strategize. They agreed on a two-pronged approach. First, to formally contest the rezoning application through the appropriate county channels, and second, to begin assembling a more comprehensive legal case that would document the pattern of harassment and interference Jake had endured. Richard also suggested bringing in an independent appraiser to assess the economic impact of the damage to Jake's dock and business, laying the groundwork for potential claims for damages. Jake agreed and authorized Richard to proceed. Meanwhile, on the ground, tensions around the lake continued to build. Signs promoting the Gala were now everywhere, and the committee's contractors had begun staging equipment along the shore. In a particularly bold move, they erected a temporary structure, an oversized floating dock intended to serve as the centerpiece for the Gala's opening ceremony, directly in front of Jake's property line, extending well into the section of the lake, traditionally associated with his riparian rights. It was a clear provocation, designed to signal the committee's disregard for his legal claims. Jake responded by filing an official notice of encroachment with the county recorder's office, accompanied by a formal cease and desist letter drafted by Richard. The letter cited the relevant statutes and included copies of Jake's recorded property documents, making it clear that any further interference would trigger immediate legal action. Richard also forwarded the letter to the committee's legal counsel, ensuring that there would be no claim of ignorance on their part. Despite these measures, the committee's provocations continued. Contractors working on the Gala site began parking their vehicles on the access road leading to Jake's boathouse, blocking deliveries and making it difficult for his customers to reach the dock. Complaints to the sheriff's department produced only polite indifference. The deputies clearly had no interest in getting involved in what they viewed as a civil dispute. More troubling was the sudden appearance of "No Trespassing" signs staked along the edge of Jake's property, signs that he had neither ordered nor authorized. Someone was trying to create the impression that Jake's land was in legal limbo, further discouraging customers and suppliers from doing business with him. Through it all, Jake remained outwardly calm, but beneath the surface his resolve only hardened. He had seen enough to understand that this was no longer just about his dock or his business. It was about whether he would allow himself to be bullied off his land by a group of opportunistic newcomers who cared more about marketing their vision of the lake than respecting the people who had lived and worked there for generations. As the date of the gala approached, the stakes continued to rise. Jake's maintenance work on the dam was scheduled to begin 3 days before the event, and despite the committee's increasingly frantic efforts to derail it, all the necessary permits and notifications were in place. The company contracted to perform the inspection and adjustments was reputable and had no ties to the local political scene, making it unlikely that Karen's allies would be able to intimidate them into backing out. Still, Jake took no chances. He arranged for an independent surveyor to document the lake conditions before and after the maintenance work, creating an objective record in case the committee tried to allege sabotage or misconduct. He also asked Richard to prepare a formal statement explaining the timing and scope of the work, which would be distributed to local officials and the press if necessary. Meanwhile, Karen's rhetoric grew more shrill. At a community meeting just days before the gala, she railed against selfish actors who were jeopardizing the future of the lake for personal gain. Though she never named Jake directly, everyone in the room knew exactly who she meant. The newer residents cheered her on, eager to be part of what they saw as a transformative moment for their community. The older families, those who had lived around the lake for decades, were more reserved. Many of them sympathized with Jake's position but feared becoming targets themselves if they spoke out. Jake had no illusions about the battle ahead. He knew that even with the dam work proceeding as planned, Karen would find new ways to press her advantage. But he also knew that by securing control of the dam, he had shifted the balance of power in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time since this fight had begun, Jake had the ability to dictate terms rather than simply react to the committee's provocations. And as he watched the committee's floating dock sway precariously in the receding waterline, he couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. In the days following the formal notice Jake had filed regarding the illegal floating dock and the series of committee provocations, the atmosphere around the lake turned even more charged. The gala date was fast approaching, and with every inch of water lost to the slow but steady maintenance drawdown at the dam, the committee's carefully staged preparations were unraveling in plain view. Temporary gangways now ended awkwardly several feet above the water's edge, and expensive floating stages were settling onto soft mudbanks exposed by the receding lake. To anyone observing, it was clear that the event's organizers were scrambling, but it was also clear that they were unwilling to back down. And neither, for that matter, was Jake. By midweek, the tension reached a new level when Jake arrived at his property one morning to find a survey crew stationed at the edge of his land. They were dressed in municipal contractor uniforms and carried state-of-the-art equipment, methodically planting bright orange stakes along what they claimed was the newly proposed shoreline boundary. Jake approached calmly and asked to see their permit. The lead surveyor, a younger man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation, handed over a work order issued by the committee's legal counsel, citing a pending rezoning action still under county review. Jake noted that the document lacked any official county stamp or authorization, and calmly informed the crew that unless they could present a valid permit issued by the county itself, they were trespassing. The surveyor hesitated but ultimately signaled for the crew to pack up. leaving the orange stakes behind as a not-so-subtle message. That evening, Jake consulted Richard once again. The veteran attorney was growing visibly more concerned with the committee's increasingly aggressive tactics. "They're trying to manufacture a record of customary public access by staging these kinds of actions," Richard explained. "If they can create the appearance that your shoreline is no longer under exclusive private control, they'll have a stronger argument in the rezoning hearings. You need to document everything. Photos, timestamps, witness statements if possible." Jake nodded grimly, already resolved to implement a more comprehensive record-keeping system. He invested in professional-grade security cameras and hired a private land surveyor to perform an independent boundary verification, ensuring that he would have ironclad evidence of any further encroachments. Word of the confrontation with the survey crew spread quickly around the lake community, and the response was mixed. Some of the older residents quietly expressed their support for Jake, but most of the newer property owners remained aligned with the committee, eager to see the lakefront improved to match their upscale expectations. Karen, for her part, seized the narrative, issuing a public statement through the committee's social media channels accusing certain individuals of obstructing a vital community initiative and undermining public safety. The post stopped short of naming Jake directly but included several images of the now half-submerged committee dock in front of his property, accompanied by inflammatory captions about reckless water-level tampering. Jake was prepared for this kind of smear campaign. With Richard's help, he drafted a formal response, which was sent not only to the committee's council but also to key county officials overseeing environmental compliance and waterway management. The letter reaffirmed the legality of the dam maintenance, cited state regulatory requirements, and included documentation of the scheduled work and pre-maintenance inspections. It also made clear that any further defamatory statements would result in immediate legal action. The letter had its intended effect. While Karen continued to grandstand at community meetings, the committee's public posts took on a more cautious tone in the following days. Despite these countermeasures, the harassment continued to escalate. One morning, Jake discovered that the access road to his boathouse had been blocked overnight by a pile of gravel and construction debris. The materials bore no markings, and none of the committee's contractors claimed responsibility. When Jake reported the obstruction to the sheriff's office, the responding deputy filed a report but admitted that without witnesses or direct evidence, little could be done. "I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Mr. Burns," the deputy said with a resigned shrug. "This is political now. The committee's got connections, and nobody in this office wants to get in the middle of it." Frustrated but undeterred, Jake arranged for the debris to be cleared at his own expense and doubled down on security measures. He also began keeping a detailed log of every incident, no matter how small, a record that would later prove invaluable. Meanwhile, Richard moved forward with a formal request for injunctive relief to halt the committee's unauthorized activities pending resolution of the rezoning application. The request was submitted to the county's circuit court, accompanied by affidavits from Jake's surveyor and multiple experts attesting to the historical and legal validity of his riparian rights. As legal motions advanced, the committee's inner circle appeared to grow increasingly desperate. Contractors loyal to Karen began working extended hours on the Gala infrastructure, often well into the night, despite the obvious logistical challenges posed by the falling water level. Rumors circulated that Karen was considering bringing in portable water pumps in a last-ditch effort to artificially maintain the Gala site's navigability, an idea that drew swift objections from environmental regulators when word reached the county office. Then came a move Jake had anticipated but still found infuriating. Late one afternoon, he received notice that the committee had filed an emergency appeal with the county zoning board, seeking expedited approval of their rezoning application based on what they described as immediate community benefit and economic necessity. The hearing was scheduled with minimal public notice, clearly an attempt to catch opponents off guard. Richard responded decisively, filing a formal objection to the expedited process and preparing for what would almost certainly be a contentious public hearing. In the days leading up to the zoning board session, Jake's supporters quietly began to emerge. Several longtime lake residents, angered by the committee's heavy-handed tactics, volunteered to provide statements in support of Jake's position. Even a few local business owners, initially wary of taking sides, stepped forward after learning about the behind-the-scenes pressure campaign targeting Jake's suppliers and partners. The hearing itself proved to be a turning point. Despite Karen's impassioned testimony about unlocking the lake's full potential, the zoning board expressed clear skepticism about the committee's claims. Richard's presentation, bolstered by expert testimony and a meticulously documented timeline of harassment, left little doubt about the true nature of the dispute. Though the board declined to issue an immediate ruling, the tone of the proceedings suggested that the committee's bid for expedited approval was unlikely to succeed. Karen left the hearing visibly shaken, her confident facade slipping for the first time in weeks. Jake, though exhausted, felt a surge of cautious optimism. The fight was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. Yet, even as the legal battle unfolded, the committee continued to seek new avenues of attack. Late-night drone flights buzzed over Jake's property, clearly intended to intimidate and gather intelligence. Anonymous complaints were filed with the State Department of Environmental Protection, triggering another round of inspections. And in a particularly underhanded move, Karen's allies attempted to pressure Jake's primary boat insurance provider into canceling his coverage on the grounds of increased liability exposure. Anticipating such tactics, Jake had already begun diversifying his business relationships and securing alternative insurance options. Each new harassment attempt was met with a measured, legally sound response, gradually eroding the committee's credibility with local officials. By the time the dam maintenance work entered its final phase, just days before the gala, Jake had established a clear and unassailable legal record of good faith compliance and defensive action. The lake itself, however, told the most compelling story. With the water level reduced to facilitate necessary structural inspections, the committee's elaborate floating infrastructure lay exposed and unusable. Vendors began canceling their gala contracts, unwilling to risk participating in an event marred by logistical chaos and legal uncertainty. What had once been promoted as a showcase of the community's new era was now shaping up to be an embarrassing debacle. As Jake surveyed the lake from his porch, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the damp, exposed shoreline, he reflected on how far things had come. The battle was grueling, the outcome still uncertain, but he had not backed down. More importantly, he had proven that with careful planning, legal precision, and unyielding resolve, it was possible to stand against those who sought to rewrite the rules to suit their ambitions. And as the committee's floating dock sagged further into the mud with each passing day, Jake knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fight was no longer just about his dock. It was about preserving the very character and integrity of the lake itself. By the time the final week before the gala arrived, the battle over the lake had shifted from a simmering standoff to a full-fledged power struggle, with each side maneuvering carefully through legal, social, and political channels. Jake, for all his steady outward calm, understood that the confrontation was now larger than anything he had initially imagined. What had started as a blatant act of vandalism against his dock had evolved into a test of whether a small group of well-connected opportunists could override decades of property law, local tradition, and the rights of individuals in favor of their grandiose redevelopment ambitions. In the quiet moments of the early mornings when he stood by the boathouse watching the steadily dropping waterline, Jake reflected on how quickly his life had been consumed by this fight, and how much was truly at stake, not just for him, but for the entire character of the lake community, Yet, amid the legal filings, zoning hearings, and public skirmishes, a new development emerged, one that would ultimately shift the entire dynamic of the conflict in Jake's favor. It began with an unexpected call from Richard late one evening. The attorney had been quietly investigating the ownership records of the dam and its controlling company ever since Jake had finalized his acquisition, looking for any potential legal vulnerabilities that Karen's team might try to exploit. In the course of his research, Richard had come across a series of older easement agreements tied to the dam property. Agreements that, while largely forgotten in recent years, still held considerable legal weight. Among them was a restrictive covenant that explicitly limited certain types of shoreline construction within a designated buffer zone extending outward from the dam's spillway and flood plain, a zone that, as it turned out, encompassed a significant portion of the area where Karen's Gala infrastructure had been erected. The implications were immediately clear. By placing their floating docks, staging platforms, and other temporary structures within the restricted zone, without notifying the dam's controlling entity, now Jake, they had not only violated long-standing covenants, but potentially exposed themselves to liability for interfering with the safe operation of the dam itself. The timing could not have been more fortuitous. Richard wasted no time in preparing a formal legal notice citing the violations and demanding immediate removal of the offending structures. The notice, delivered by certified courier to the committee's offices, sent shockwaves through their ranks. For the first time, they were faced not with abstract legal arguments or property line disputes, but with a hard, incontrovertible fact. Their Gala infrastructure was now on record as violating clear, enforceable legal restrictions tied directly to dam safety, a subject sure to attract scrutiny from county and state regulators. Karen's reaction was as swift as it was desperate. Within hours of receiving the notice, she convened an emergency meeting of her inner circle, and attempts were made to quietly dismantle and relocate some of the offending structures. But the damage had already been done. Jake's surveyor, acting on Richard's advice, had thoroughly documented the original placement of the platforms with time-stamped photographs and sworn affidavits, ensuring that any belated attempts at compliance would not erase the record of their prior violation. Moreover, word of the covenant breach quickly reached the county's Public Works Department, which had jurisdiction over dam safety compliance. County inspectors were dispatched to the lake, and their preliminary findings confirmed the violations, triggering an official notice of inquiry that would cast a long shadow over the Gala's remaining preparations. For Jake, the revelation of the covenant and its enforcement marked a crucial turning point. Up to that point, much of his defense had relied on asserting his rights and countering Karen's aggressive maneuvers. Now, for the first time, he held a proactive legal lever capable of placing the committee squarely on the defensive. It was a shift not lost on the broader community either. Longtime residents who had previously remained on the sidelines began speaking out more openly in support of Jake's position, emboldened by the visible cracks emerging in the committee's facade of invincibility. Even some of the newer homeowners, previously enthralled by Karen's vision, began to question whether the promised revitalization was worth the mounting legal controversies and community division it had spawned. Amid these shifting dynamics, another layer of complexity emerged when a quiet but significant ally approached Jake through Richard. A mid-level county planning official, long frustrated by the committee's increasingly brazen disregard for procedural norms, had come forward with valuable insight. The official provided documentation revealing that the committee had submitted several key components of their Gala site plan without full disclosure of the easement restrictions or pending zoning challenges, effectively misleading county reviewers in an effort to fast-track approvals. This information, while requiring careful handling to avoid compromising the official, provided yet another avenue for Jake and Richard to pursue: formal administrative challenges to the Gala permits based on material misrepresentation. With these new tools in hand, Jake and Richard crafted a multifaceted strategy for the critical days ahead. They prepared formal submissions to county regulators, reinforced their legal claims regarding the covenant violations, and continued pressing for full injunctive relief against any further unauthorized construction or shoreline modification. Meanwhile, the ongoing dam maintenance proceeded on schedule, steadily reducing the lake's water level to the documented safe inspection threshold. As the exposed shoreline grew and the committee's floating infrastructure sagged further into the mud, the visual impact became impossible for even the most partisan observers to ignore. Through it all, Jake remained resolute. He made a conscious choice to avoid public grandstanding or inflammatory rhetoric, understanding that his strongest position lay in the quiet, methodical pursuit of legal and procedural correctness. Yet the community's mood was palpably changing. At the local marina, where once whispered gossip had dominated conversations, boat owners now openly discussed the committee's overreach and the likelihood of further fallout. At the town diner, longtime residents openly praised Jake's tenacity, and even a few committee members' spouses were heard questioning Karen's increasingly combative stance. As Jake stood on the lakeshore one evening, watching the last contractors futilely attempting to reposition sunken staging equipment, he understood that the conflict had entered a new phase. The Gala's prospects were rapidly dimming, its logistical viability compromised beyond repair. More importantly, the committee's political capital was waning, its veneer of community consensus eroded by its own overreach. Yet Jake also knew that victory was not assured, and that complacency would be a mistake. Karen and her remaining allies were cornered, and cornered opponents often resorted to desperate measures. With this in mind, Jake doubled his efforts, instructing Richard to maintain constant communication with county officials and preparing additional filings to safeguard against any last-minute legal ambushes. He also convened a quiet meeting with several supportive neighbors and business partners, not to orchestrate a counter-campaign, but to ensure that the community's core values, respect for the lake, its history, and the rights of all who lived there, remained front and center amid the unfolding drama. In this, as in all else, Jake remained true to the principles that had guided him from the start. The fight for the lake was no longer just about legal technicalities or shoreline boundaries. It was about preserving a way of life, one grounded in respect, stewardship, and a deep sense of place. As the final days before the gala approached, the tone around the lake grew unmistakably darker. What had begun months ago as a public relations campaign wrapped in the language of community revitalization had by now devolved into a bitter war of attrition, and everyone knew it. The committee's dream of transforming the lakefront into a luxury destination had run aground, both literally and figuratively, and despite the visible signs of failure, the stranded docks, the exposed shoreline, the half-collapsed event stages, Karen Miller and her remaining inner circle refused to concede defeat. For Jake Burns, the situation demanded unrelenting vigilance. Though he had the law on his side and a growing wave of public support behind him, he also understood that cornered adversaries were often the most dangerous. What followed in those last tense days was a sequence of calculated provocations and last-ditch power plays that pushed the entire conflict to the brink. It began with a series of late-night intrusions on Jake's property. One evening, shortly after midnight, the motion-triggered cameras Jake had installed recorded a group of unidentified individuals trespassing along the wooded edge of his shoreline. Though masked and dressed in dark clothing, they were clearly carrying tools and appeared to be surveying the remaining exposed structures near the boathouse. Before Jake could respond in person, he had been alerted remotely by his surveillance system. The group had vanished back into the night, leaving only faint boot prints in the mud. The following morning, he discovered that several of the boundary markers placed by his surveyor had been uprooted and discarded in the underbrush, an unmistakable warning. Jake reported the incident to the sheriff's office, which dutifully logged the complaint but once again offered little in the way of proactive enforcement. Undeterred, Jake immediately contacted Richard, who advised documenting everything thoroughly and filing an official notice of trespass with both the Sheriff's Department and the County Land Records Office. Richard also recommended hiring a professional security consultant to enhance the property's surveillance perimeter. Jake took the advice to heart, and within days, a discreet team had upgraded his system with higher-resolution cameras, infrared sensors, and real-time monitoring linked to a secure off-site server. The message was clear. If the committee's supporters intended to escalate to physical intimidation, they would now face a far more sophisticated defense. Simultaneously, the committee launched a fresh wave of legal maneuvering. Karen's attorneys filed an emergency motion with the county court, seeking a temporary injunction to halt Jake's dam maintenance on the grounds that it constituted an imminent threat to public safety and economic stability. The motion was based on a hastily compiled packet of dubious expert opinions and photographs of the Gala's damaged infrastructure, images that conveniently ignored the committee's own documented violations of the dam easement covenants. Richard swiftly countered with a comprehensive legal response, complete with sworn affidavits from the licensed dam inspection team, county-approved maintenance permits, and a detailed timeline proving that the water level adjustments had been conducted in strict accordance with state safety regulations. The hearing on the injunction request became a spectacle in itself. County courtroom observers noted that it drew an unusually large audience for what was nominally a technical matter of waterway management. In reality, it had become the latest flashpoint in the broader community struggle, with residents from all sides packing the gallery. Karen appeared in person, flanked by a visibly rattled legal team, while Jake remained composed and accompanied by Richard and the dam engineers. After several hours of testimony and legal argument, the presiding judge, known for his methodical approach and disdain for theatrics, delivered a decisive ruling. The court found no basis for the committee's claims of imminent harm, upheld the legality of the dam maintenance, and explicitly affirmed Jake's compliance with all relevant regulatory requirements. So, the injunction was denied in full. The fallout from this legal defeat was swift. Local media outlets, which had largely remained neutral until this point, began covering the conflict in earnest. Headlines focused on the court's rejection of the committee's emergency motion, and public opinion began shifting more visibly in Jake's favor. Even among the committee's prior supporters, a growing sense of unease was palpable. Vendors continued to pull out of the gala, citing not only logistical challenges but also reputational concerns. Sponsors withdrew quietly. What had been promoted as a signature community event was now viewed as a legal and political debacle. Karen, however, was not finished. In a desperate attempt to regain momentum, she orchestrated a surprise action at the lake. Early one morning, without prior notice, a crew of hired contractors arrived with portable pumps and began attempting to divert water from nearby tributaries into the receding lake basin. The plan was obvious: to artificially raise the water level just enough to salvage a portion of the Gala infrastructure. But the effort was both technically flawed and legally indefensible. Within hours, environmental inspectors, already on heightened alert due to the prior covenant violations, intervened and ordered the operation halted. County officials issued immediate cease-and-desist orders, and Richard prepared additional legal filings to document the unauthorized activity. At this stage, the conflict took on an even more personal edge. Jake's boat rental clients, many of whom were longtime friends and neighbors, began reporting instances of harassment and intimidation. Cars with out-of-state plates were observed cruising the access road near Jake's boathouse, sometimes pausing to take photos. One of Jake's seasonal employees received an anonymous threatening phone call late at night. Though impossible to trace directly to Karen or her known associates, the pattern was clear. Someone was trying to create a climate of fear. Jake responded as he always had, not with bluster, but with careful, measured action. He met privately with his staff, advised them on legal rights and personal safety, and expanded his security measures further. Throughout this escalation, Jake remained steadfastly committed to one principle. He would not be provoked into making a misstep. Richard reinforced this strategy at every turn. "You've got them on the defensive," he counseled. "Don't give them an opening. Let the record show who is acting in good faith, and who is acting recklessly." Jake agreed. He continued cooperating fully with regulatory authorities, maintained meticulous documentation of every incident, and refused to engage in the committee's escalating public rhetoric. Behind the scenes, however, strategic preparations were advancing. Richard and a growing team of allied attorneys and experts were finalizing a comprehensive legal action not only to secure permanent injunctive relief against further committee interference, but also to seek compensatory damages for the vandalism of Jake's dock, the sustained harassment campaign, and the business disruptions caused by the committee's conduct. The legal case was formidable, and its potential implications for the committee's future were profound. Word of this impending lawsuit began circulating quietly among community leaders and county officials, further isolating Karen and her dwindling core of supporters. The final escalation came on the eve of the gala itself. Desperate to project an image of resilience, Karen announced that a scaled-back community gathering would proceed at a secondary venue along the eastern shore. But even this plan quickly unraveled. The county fire marshal, responding to reports of code violations, inspected the alternate site and found numerous deficiencies: electrical hazards, inadequate emergency access, and unpermitted temporary structures. The event permit was revoked and the gathering canceled at the last possible moment. As dawn broke on what was supposed to have been the gala's opening day, the lake lay quiet beneath a pale sky. The exposed shoreline remained, a stark visual testament to the committee's hubris and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Jake, standing once more by his boathouse, watched as the last few remnants of the gala infrastructure were dismantled and hauled away. He felt no triumph, only a deep sense of vindication. The fight had been exhausting, but it had been necessary, and through it all, he had remained true to his principles. Yet Jake also knew that this was not the end. The legal battles would continue, as would the work of restoring trust and cohesion within the lake community. There would be further hearings, further filings, and undoubtedly more attempts by Karen and her allies to salvage their reputations. But for the first time in months, Jake could see a clear path forward, one grounded not in conflict but in the quiet, steady work of stewardship and community building that had always defined his relationship with the lake. And as he turned back toward the house, the early sun glinting off the water's rippled surface, Jake allowed himself a small but resolute thought. Whatever came next, he would face it on his terms, and he would not stand alone. The morning after what should have been the gala, the lakefront was eerily still. The wind carried only the faint sounds of dismantling, contractors loading up unused equipment, temporary fencing coming down, sagging banners stripped from poles and stuffed hastily into vans. The grand event that had been marketed as the rebirth of the lake community had collapsed into a logistical and reputational disaster. Across town, whispers were spreading faster than any official statement could contain. Local business owners were furious about unpaid vendor fees and canceled orders. Sponsors who had once courted the committee were now quietly distancing themselves, their legal departments assessing potential liabilities tied to the unauthorized easement violations and failed permits. And at the center of it all was Karen Miller, who had retreated from public view in the wake of her latest and most public defeat. Jake Burns, meanwhile, remained steadfast. He had not celebrated. There was nothing joyous about what had transpired. The lake, in its exposed state, bore silent witness to the consequences of unchecked ambition. And while Jake had succeeded in protecting his rights and stopping an illegal project, the scars left on the community would take longer to mend. Still, he understood that the battle had reached its defining moment. The legal filings Richard had prepared were ready to move forward, and the county regulators, now fully apprised of the committee's pattern of misconduct, had launched formal inquiries of their own. The question now was not whether there would be accountability, but how far it would reach and how many of Karen's enablers would be drawn into the legal fallout. 2 days after the failed gala, an official summons was served to Karen and several key committee members, initiating the first phase of civil litigation. The suit, filed on Jake's behalf, sought substantial damages for property destruction, business interference, and personal harassment, and named specific individuals whose documented actions had contributed to the campaign against Jake. The legal team had built the case meticulously, drawing on months of surveillance footage, sworn affidavits from witnesses, and a damning paper trail of unauthorized activities and misrepresentations. In parallel, state environmental regulators had opened a separate investigation into the illegal water diversion attempt, a move that carried the potential for both civil penalties and criminal referrals. The filing of the lawsuit triggered an immediate response from Karen's camp, though it was a far cry from the confident posturing that had characterized their earlier tactics. Karen's personal attorney issued a cautious public statement denying any wrongdoing but conspicuously avoiding direct reference to the covenant violations or the failed injunction motion. Meanwhile, her former allies on the committee began to fracture. Several lower-ranking members, faced with potential personal liability and public scrutiny, reached out to Richard's office seeking to provide information in exchange for limited legal exposure. The internal divisions that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted in full view of the community. As the legal process advanced, a county hearing was scheduled to formally review the status of the committee's zoning application, a process that, under normal circumstances, would have been a routine bureaucratic step. But with the failed gala, the covenant violations, and the ongoing litigation now central to the public discourse, the hearing drew unprecedented attention. Residents packed the meeting hall and local media outlets sent full crews to cover the proceedings live. Jake attended in person, accompanied by Richard and a small group of supportive neighbors. He remained composed as Karen, appearing visibly diminished and flanked by a visibly reduced legal team, attempted to argue for the merits of the rezoning initiative. But the board, having reviewed the full dossier of recent events, was unsparing in its questioning. Board members grilled Karen and her counsel on the unauthorized construction within the dam buffer zone, the concealed easement restrictions, and the illegal water pumping operation, all actions now documented in official reports. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that the committee's rezoning effort was dead. The board voted unanimously to suspend further consideration, pending the outcome of the ongoing investigations and civil litigation. The vote was met with audible approval from the audience, a rare moment of unified community sentiment after months of division. Karen left the hall without offering comment, trailed by a shrinking circle of loyalists. For Jake, this pivotal moment marked the culmination of months of relentless pressure and carefully measured resistance. He had not sought this conflict, but he had refused to be intimidated or outmaneuvered. And now, with the legal tide turning decisively in his favor, the path to restoring order and accountability was clearer than ever. Yet Jake also understood that the final chapters of this saga remained to be written. The civil suit would proceed, likely drawing in additional parties as discovery advanced. The state's environmental investigation continued to gather evidence, with potential implications for both personal and organizational culpability. And beyond the legal arena, the lake community itself faced the challenge of healing the divisions that the committee's failed power grab had wrought. In the weeks that followed, Jake remained actively engaged, but always with an eye toward long-term stewardship rather than short-term retribution. He met regularly with Richard and the legal team, providing testimony and assisting with evidence compilation. At the same time, he began working with a coalition of fellow residents, both old guard families and newer arrivals, who shared a commitment to preserving the lake's integrity and respecting the rights of all property owners. The goal was not merely to oppose Karen's agenda, but to articulate a constructive vision for the lake's future, one rooted in transparency, lawful governance, and genuine community engagement. Meanwhile, the broader fallout from the failed gala continued to unfold. Vendors began filing breach of contract claims against the committee. Sponsors publicly withdrew their endorsements. County officials, eager to restore public trust, initiated a comprehensive review of the committee's operational practices, with the potential for significant restructuring or even formal dissolution. And through it all, Jake remained the calm center of the storm, a man who had defended his land and his principles with unwavering resolve, and who now stood as a respected voice in the renewed dialogue about the lake's future. Late one evening, as he walked the shoreline near his restored dock, now fully repaired and more resilient than ever, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The lake, bathed in the soft glow of a rising moon, seemed at peace once more, its waters steady and untroubled. The fight had been hard, the stakes high, but in the end he had prevailed not through force or spectacle, but through patience, preparation, and the unshakable conviction that right still mattered in a world too often swayed by ambition and greed. And as the ripples lapped gently against the pilings, Jake allowed himself a rare smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. Whatever battles remained ahead, he would face them as he always had, with steady hands, clear eyes, and the unwavering knowledge that this place, this lake, was worth defending. In the months that followed the failed gala and the decisive zoning board hearing, a quiet but unmistakable shift took place around the lake. The once emboldened committee had been thoroughly discredited, its leadership fractured, its reputation in tatters. Karen Miller, once the driving force behind the lakefront redevelopment scheme, had resigned from the committee under mounting legal and public pressure. Her resignation statement, issued through her attorney, was carefully worded to avoid admissions of wrongdoing, but no one in the community was fooled. The damage to her standing was irreparable. Meanwhile, several of her closest allies had likewise withdrawn from public roles, their legal entanglements mounting as the civil suit advanced and state investigators pressed forward with inquiries into the illegal pumping operation and related violations. For Jake Burns, the resolution of the most intense phase of the conflict brought a profound, if understated, sense of vindication. The legal battle was far from over. Litigation was an inherently slow and grinding process, but the balance of power had decisively shifted. Where once he had stood largely alone against a coordinated campaign of harassment, Jake now found himself surrounded by a growing coalition of supporters, longtime residents grateful for his principled stand, newer property owners eager to see governance of the lake restored to transparency and lawful process, and even local officials who had quietly begun to view Jake as a stabilizing force amid the community's upheaval. Through it all, Jake remained true to his nature, calm, deliberate, and resolutely focused on constructive outcomes rather than personal vendettas. One of the earliest tangible signs of this new dynamic came when the county announced the formation of an interim advisory council to oversee lake-related planning and regulatory matters, while the future of the now discredited committee was formally resolved. Jake was invited to participate, not as a figurehead or political token, but as a respected stakeholder whose legal expertise and demonstrated commitment to the lake's welfare were beyond question. Though naturally averse to the politics of such roles, Jake agreed to serve, viewing it as a necessary step toward ensuring that the abuses of the past were not repeated. In his first meetings with the advisory council, he advocated for clear governance structures, full transparency in financial and operational matters, and above all, respect for existing property rights and environmental protections. His measured, principled approach resonated with many, helping to lay the groundwork for a more balanced and inclusive governance model moving forward. At the same time, Jake turned his attention to restoring and strengthening his own operations. The repairs to his dock and boathouse had long since been completed, but now he began expanding his offerings, forging new partnerships with local businesses and tourism groups eager to rebuild the lake's reputation as an authentic and welcoming destination. The legal cloud that had hung over his enterprise had lifted, and clients, both old and new, returned in growing numbers. More importantly, the broader narrative surrounding Jake's role in the lake community had transformed. No longer merely the target of a smear campaign, he was now widely regarded as a steward of the lake's integrity, a role he embraced not with pride, but with a deep sense of responsibility. Throughout this period of renewal, Jake maintained close collaboration with Richard and the legal team, ensuring that the ongoing litigation remained firmly on course. Depositions were taken, discovery progressed, and settlement discussions, tentatively initiated by counsel for certain former committee members, began to surface. Jake made it clear that while he was open to reasonable resolution, accountability was non-negotiable. The destruction of his dock, the sustained campaign of harassment, and the illegal attempts to manipulate lake levels had caused real harm, not only to him but to the community as a whole. Any settlement would need to reflect that reality, both in financial terms and in enforceable commitments to lawful governance. Amid these developments, Jake also found time to reconnect with the lake itself in a more personal way. The long months of legal conflict had left little room for the simple pleasures that had first drawn him to this place: early morning fishing trips, sunset cruises, quiet hours tending to the boats and shoreline. Now, with the waters stabilized and the political noise receding, he reclaimed those moments with a renewed sense of appreciation. Friends and neighbors often joined him, conversations turning not to lawsuits or zoning battles, but to the shared love of the lake and its natural beauty. It was, in many ways, the most meaningful victory of all, a restoration not only of rights and property, but of the very spirit of the place. As the first signs of autumn touched the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, Jake stood once more at the end of his dock, gazing out over the calm expanse of water. The journey had been longer and harder than he could have imagined, the stakes higher than he had ever intended. But through patience, resolve, and an unwavering commitment to principle, he had prevailed, not by force or bluster, but by the steady application of truth and law. The lake remained as it had always been, a place of quiet beauty, of deep history, and of enduring community. And for Jake Burns, there was no greater reward than knowing he had helped to preserve it, not only for himself, but for all who called it home.